I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker has since 2008 been the Queen and now the King's Sculptor in Ordinary in Scotland. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, he has become a figurehead in the neoclassical sculpture movement, especially known for his statues of Adam Smith, David Hume, James Maxwell, Robert Louis Stevenson, and others, which adorn the Scottish landscape and the Royal Mile. In 2012, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In 2019, he began work on a 14-foot tall statue of Leon Alberti Bernini with a new architecture building at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. It's his single tallest work. A frequent speaker in his discipline, his commentaries on the neoclassical tradition and the power of beauty challenge, compel, and certainly entertain. We are extremely pleased to welcome back to the Catholic Art Institute, Alexander Stoddart.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you. Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for having me. If I'm speaking like this, can you all hear me? Yes. James talked about the rules of architecture, the foundational rules of architecture. Vitruvius said it was firmness, and then utility, and then some contribution to beauty, whatever that is. The sinister modernist architect Philip Johnson, great friend of Joseph Goebbels and other such perishers, he said that the first law of architecture is to get the job. And you can see his point. In my view, the first law of architecture is to protect the job from the client. You write the check and you go away and watch the television. Nothing worse than a client with ideas, I find. Okay, well, the client in this case was something else. If we're talking about art and virtue, what about art and vice? It wasn't even vice in Hitler's case. He wasn't decent enough even to take a drink. So it's not virtue and art and vice, it would be art and evil. What about that then? There's an interesting thing about this, that Hitler's regime, and of course he is fundamentally the most important historical figure, cultural figure of the 20th century, because what he did was essentially illegalize a vast tradition and allowed a modernist movement to confer upon him alone tutelage over that great architectural tradition. Modernism said, Adolf, big man, you can have all this classical architecture. It's yours forever. And because you're the worst man in the world, it will give us the torch of rectitude. As modernists, the very architects you couldn't stand. Of course, what he was trying to do was add order to a world. And he did it in a political way which was utterly chaotic and a disaster. But also, he started to do it with artwork. I'm annoyed about this. I'm going to take this out here because I have to turn. I'm like the priest, you see. I want to be facing the same way as you're facing. You see, now you're a congregation. Now you're an audience. Okay. Sorry. So, he's got this plan for Berlin. Berlin was always very contrary to the Nazi idea. It was full of jazz clubs and all sorts of things like this. And it was very difficult for the Gauleiter to manage that. So Berlin was going to get a complete remake, and it was going to be called Germania. And at the end of it, there was going to be a people's hall right at the far end of this vast axis. Everything is designed off essentially Parisian monuments, because this is to be an expression of Hitler's resentment at the Versailles arrangements and against France and Paris in particular. So everything is a few meters broader than anything you'd find in Paris. It's quite a cretinous and infantile attitude to take. Anyway, the more I hear of him, the worse he seems to have been. Anyway, so at the end, there's this great big dome here. Now, if I can turn this slide round. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, there they are. That's Albert Speer and Adolf Hitler having fun. They just we'll put that wee bit up there. This is the pavilion for the big Paris exhibition. The whole of Europe, of course, was absolutely furious. The artists of Europe were really sick with jealousy, because here is a country that's got a president or a leader, whatever, who's absolutely obsessed with art and architecture. Like sculptors like Aristide Maillol and people are positively fighting to get to Germany because they're desperate to have somebody that gives a damn. You know, Mies van der Rohe is furiously trying to get to design the new Reichsbank. Hitler didn't like his work, so he gave him a couple of toilet stops and an autobahn to design. And so he went scuttling off to Chicago here, pretending that he was being terribly persecuted. He was just cheesed off, you know. Albert Speer went on to design some things, particularly, this work here. That's that big dome close up. Now, I'll tell you a story about this, and this is one of the most astounding things that ever happened to me. It really is a story. Well, when my oldest daughter, Clara, who's been in your company a few years ago, was about 13, you know, a child, still nice, but on the turn. I was producing a talk for Strathclyde University Architecture Department. By some accident, I'd been asked to give a speech. And so I thought, well, all the poor students will be there and they'll have their right-on sanctimonious lecturers will be present, you know, all sitting there with their mouths like a pussycat's bottom. You know, and I thought, I'm going to be quite naughty about this. So I'm going to do a talk entitled Hating Classical Architecture. And, you know, pathologise why it is the tutors all start rocking in anxiety when you mention a column. So I had this slide up on the computer screen at home, you see, getting my slides ready. And Clara, this 13-year-old, she's been through the Scottish education system, so she has no history, you understand, no knowledge whatsoever. And she walks in and she sees this up on the screen and says, "Wow, where's that? Where's that?" You see, because that sort of propaganda sky in the picture I had. I said, "Darling, that's a plaster model. It got terribly badly damaged in 1945. And the scheme was to be finished from 1956, actually, but the client had a sort of packed half-decade, and it was never done. Died, indeed. It died before it was finished. And she said, "Oh, who was the client?" And I said to her, "Well, his name was Adolf Hitler." The child visibly started and said then the immortal words, but wasn't he a really bad man? You see what's happened here? A perfect innocent come down from heaven has seen the form of the good, and she cannot relate it to the concept of the worst. So then we went on to discuss it, and she said something to the effect, wouldn't Hitler, an evil man, be building the rubbish that we see getting built all the time today? And that's absolutely true. It was a brilliant and devastating account of the truth. The child sees the form of the good and cannot equate it. And I said to her that badness, you see, always just shows itself quite clearly. But evil hides behind the form of the good. So that's why, for instance, at the beginning of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, we see the evil queen. And she's much more frightening at the beginning, when she's speaking to the mirror on the wall, than she is at the end, when she's transformed herself into an old hag. Because she has, at the beginning, the form of the good. Thus it is absolutely terrifying. Well, that was my... and I thought to myself, there must be a cause to this. And at one level, it's because the object is spherical, or connotes a sphere. And at the other hand, it's because of the enormous scale of the object. Now, I'll talk about scale first. When we see a big object in a studio, there are two types of response. Some people will run away from it and say that they're feeling insignificant. Other folk will stand and bask in the obliterative effect that a very large humanoid object will have. Here's the president. He's now looking at something. This is a fascinating photograph because you see Well, this man here, he obviously knows what he's looking at. This man here potentially is doing what's been described. And Roosevelt in the middle here is looking at a thing with an expression in his face that tells us more or less that he cannot speak. I think the technical term for it is gobsmacked. The idea of the dialectical dimension, the introduction of words for which we all crave. I mean, I'm always asked to speak much more than I'm asked to sculpt in my career. This is a fascinating photograph. When you see what they're looking at, he's in a car, of course, because his polio at that point is disabling him. Sorry. What he's looking at is a band of workers. They've been down mines in Keystone, South Dakota, for mining mica. And then the bottom's fallen out of that market, and that man that you saw directing the show, Gutzon Borglum, is the man who's carving this. Now, this is, obviously, you know, it's got its real title and its common title. The common title is Mount Rushmore, but its real title is the Shrine of Democracy. Many works have real titles that hide behind their false titles. So, for instance, Piccadilly, you know Eros at Piccadilly Circus in London. The real title is The Angel of Christian Charity. With a title like that, you've got to make a major conversion quickly. Statue of Liberty in Illuminating the World. You know, it's different, these things different. So, the thing about this work is it excites a lot of anger, and particularly on account of its scale. But there's one moment where Borglum himself, who was really a very poor sculptor, I mean, really pretty shoddy work. He was also responsible for a Lincoln statue that sits on ground level, you know, with a bit of chewing gum on the end of its nose. You know, that kind of style of sculpture that we get nowadays? They're walking along the pavement like this. And you put your arms around it, take a selfie. And so Borglum himself did that kind of work. But when he came to make Mount Rushmore, he made some terrible smaller models for the scheme. But then on the projection up to the big scale, something rather miraculous happened. Now, he went round a walk to this view of Mount Rushmore, which very few people see. It shows the isolated head of Washington. And at this spot, burst into tears, and his companion vouched for this. And he was in quite some considerable distress. I think it's because he has seen something that's better than anything he could have done himself. And he feels it's not his own work. As a boastful, egotistical individual, this would be a devastating thing. But for other kinds of artists, this is exactly the effect they want. So it's an interesting thought that this unknown view, which is one of the most stupendous views in history. Borglum was very good at publicity. He had a geologist, and he said, "How much will the stone wear down in 4,000 years?" And the geologist said, "Well, it's about that much, you know." So he said, "Oh, excellent. The thickness of a child's finger since the time of Moses." He had a way with advertising and words. Sorry. So we have a culture in the modern age of valorization of the scale of things in terms of a sense of personal hopelessness, a personal giving up on ourselves, acknowledging our weaknesses, and actually seeking for a diminution of our power. Hence, Henry Fuseli, in this drawing here, he's late 18th, early 19th century. William Blake, the mystic and draftsman, said of him, "Of all the artists I ever knew, the only one that did not make me spew was Fuseli. And he was both Turk and Jew, and so good Christian gents, how do you do?" He was neither Turk nor Jew, but he was certainly an oddball. And he painted this, or did this drawing here, entitled "The Artist in Despair over the Magnitude of Ancient Fragments." They're part of the statue of Constantine kicking about now in the gardens of the Vatican. You can see how he can't handle the perspective at the front here. See how the perspective of the pedestal totally goes to pot. You see, the scale issue has addled his sense and capacity. So the idea that size matters is very important in this kind of art. Big monuments, we've always done them, and we always ought to do them, because they entail something to do with a kind of piety. James is talking about this idea, and it's a piety which the Greeks knew as ponos, which means literally pain. In other words, you take pain. So people love buildings that great pains have been taken over. It seems to be, it stands in for a kind of godliness. So that, for instance, the backs of statues wedged into pediments will still also be perfectly carved, because unlike the man on the ground looking at the thing up there, the goddess in the temple can get everywhere. The eye of God is omnipotent. I hope I'm not breaking your machine. Right, there we go. Okay, well, in my practice, we've done quite a lot of big sculpture. It's big by contemporary standards, but not big by real standards. This is my full-time assistant, Lindsay. She's such a millennial. She's on her phone. Up the wing, my daughter Iona is a part-time assistant at the studio. They got on like a house on fire. And this is a figure in preparation which is entitled The Spirit of the Categorical Imperative. That's a mouthful. The client knows it as the spirit of duty, and he won't have anything else. And this is, in fact, a new building by Craig Hamilton that's just there, Freedom Place, they call it. And it's where George W. Bush has made his new headquarters. Harlan Crow's been the great sponsor and patron of this work, and he does let you get on with the work. It's an attempt to illustrate a poem that I knew ever since I was a choir boy in the High Baptist Church in Paisley, Coates Memorial Church. We ran a very high service, not a Baptist church at all. You know, a Baptist church that's like made of corrugated iron with something happy written on it. The Coates Church is a neo-Gothic masterpiece. It's the biggest nonconformist church built as such in Europe. But there's no congregation anymore, so it's now a venue. Oh dear. Anyway, when I was a choir boy in that choir, we used to sing Hubert Parry's great rendition of the poem by Henry Vaughan, metaphysical poet from Wales. My soul, there is a country, you know it. The poet addresses his own soul. He says, my soul, there is a country far beyond the stars, where stands a winged sentry, all skillful in the wars. There, above noise and danger, sweet peace sits, crowned with smiles, and one born in a manger commands the beauteous files. He is thy saviour and friend, and, O my soul, awake, did descend in pure love to die here for thy sake. So this is a stupendous, it goes on. It's a marvellous thing in a marvellous setting. And as a child of 8, 9 or so, this boy treble, when it sang, we sang the words, there stands a winged sentry, all skillful in the wars. I always got a picture of this work here from behind. So I was within the zone, looking at the back of the winged sentry, and then beyond him, a great opalescent landscape descending away into the west. It took me 50-odd year, whatever it was, to get to see what the front of the figure looked like, because when Harlan Crow asked me to come up with a figure of the spirit of duty, that winged sentry came rushing to my mind again. It had never been gone. So there we have it. But its big title is the genius or the angel of the categorical imperative. And that is that thing that Immanuel Kant came up with as a secularized form of what we know to be the good. Friedrich Nietzsche dismissed Kant, saying, after all, Kant is no more than a creeping Christian. And in a way, he's absolutely right. But Kant, who had Scottish ancestry, I'm pleased to assure you, Immanuel Kant comes up with a secularizing philosophical view of this notion. It's called the ought imperative, really. Do what you ought and stand in constant guard against the blandishments of what you want to do. ought over want. That's the spirit of duty. And you do it without any sense of satisfaction. Kant said that this is possible. I don't think it really is. You see, you remember Barack Obama, right? Do you remember? Sorry. You remember he came from this end of the woods, apparently. He ran for president under a tagline. Can you remember what it was? Yes, we can. Right? Now, if I'd been running for president, I would have had, perhaps we ought. And isn't that nice and diffident and uncertain? And what a loser. So, Immanuel Kant owed so much to David Hume. David Hume, who, as you all know, is the patron saint of atheists. This is a statue I made him in the Royal Mile, and you can see, by a strange twist, that now all the secularists come and worship him. The toe is getting kissed away by 1 billion pilgrim lips. You know, there are some secular humanists in Edinburgh who took great objection to this. They said David Hume would never have worn a toga, as though I'd made some sort of mistake that week, and there's a statue of Cicero kicking about in a wig and breeches. You know, complicated. I'm very pleased to say the Americans all completely understood this gesture, that if a philosopher is great enough, you relieve him of his sartorial trivia, right? Because, let's face it, who wants to be memorializing a statue in the costume you were wearing in the 1970s with that mullet? You don't want it. So what you do is you put the figure into drapery, which is unchanging. And it has also another profound effect. Drapery, you see, has a habit of hanging. Therefore, it depicts the pull of gravity, that weakest of the four forces. You know the four forces: the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and the gravitational force. And the gravitational force is by far the weakest of these things. See, for instance, it's just we think it's the strongest because the shopping's so heavy. But you see, look at this. Right, there's a wee bit of leaf there that I've just picked up, and here's a bit of spit on my finger. Right, now, look at that. The entire force of the gravitational pull of this planet cannot shift a leaf stuck to my finger with spit. That shows you how weak the gravitational force is. But of course, without it, everything just goes to pieces. So David Hume has drapery in this statue, and the drapery demonstrates the pull of gravity. This makes a connection with the work to the very center of the earth, where great crystals are said to be packed close together. Crystals the size of the Empire State Building, massed together in hell. And this gives the work, literally, gravity. Michelangelo was terrible at drapery, but the neoclassicists, I wasn't great at it when I did this, I was a boy, but, and you can see how he holds a tablet. This is the tablet that Moses went up the mountain with. And David Hume goes up the mountain in 18th century Scotland. God says, "Hello, David. I don't exist, actually." And he comes back. He comes back with nothing written, no brief, you see. So this is what this means. Interesting enough, just down the street, there's the house called John Knox's house. This is in Edinburgh in the Royal Mile. And John Knox, of course, has a highly mosaic profile. And there's an image of Moses being interviewed by God. So here it is, the Enlightenment comes, it's a tabula rasa, you can't believe in anything. And this really reflects that kind of nihilism, or resentment-filled nihilism, denialism, that we associate with Enlightenment. Although I've spent my whole life making monuments to the Enlightenment, and these monuments are getting castigated as we speak because of historical circumstances. Anyway, David Hume is very hard to read. It's easy writing, which makes hard reading. It's you know what I mean? Easy writing is hard reading. Hard writing is easy reading. And the easiest reading philosopher of them all was this man here. It always comes back to this. We check our watches at home to see what the first mention that evening of Arthur Schopenhauer might be, because I'm absolutely obsessed with him, right? Interesting, he had a very long face when he was young, then he lost all his teeth, and that happened. An interesting interior strabismus as well. You know, the eyes went in a wee bit, which is a very endearing thing. You see, it's very hard to eyeball anybody if you've got a squint. You know, and the Hindus say, you know, the eye is the source of all evil. And when you think about it, all the most predatory animals in the animal kingdom all sport very heavy eye makeup. You know, tigers, lions, hawks, 15-year-old girls. You know, really the most frightening things in the world are all big on the eye. Do you remember there used to be a thing called Daktari in the television? And there was a nice lion. It was a friendly lion. And the reason that we knew it was friendly because it had crossed eyes. It's really lovely. And I've got a slight strabismus if I take my glasses off, I promise you. So Arthur Schopenhauer was the man who wanted to do a translation of David Hume into German. But because of his beliefs and his difficult nature, and because he was against Hegel, the great dialectician, poor Schopenhauer lived in obscurity until the last 8 years of his life. Then suddenly, there was a review of one of his books by the Westminster Review, and everything changed. And Schopenhauer, the great misogynist, woman-hater, was forever in debt to the marvellous editor of the Westminster Review, a chap called George Eliot, who actually had the sense to publish a good review of his latest book. So Schopenhauer wanted to translate Hume, but never got to. It would have been great for us because he spoke absolutely perfect English and therefore could have given us a redacted version of David Hume's very stodgy prose. Nevertheless, the great thing about David Hume for me is that he gives me an inroad into all the questions that come from scale and the feeling of goodness that comes off it. Some people love it, and other people resent it. Schopenhauer's system is this. There is a metaphysical will. The religious people call it the devil. The philosophers call it the will. It is a vast metaphysical force that causes everything in the world to move. It's the opposite of the good because it entails all the savagery of existence. He's well before Darwin and makes Darwin look a bit of a plodder, frankly. Schopenhauer has imbibed the philosophy of the East, the first serious Western philosopher to do so. And Hinduism and Buddhism are a particular recourse for him. The idea of the stilling of the will, which is in all of us because it is absolutely amniotic fluid of nature's mischievous actions, is what we do in the great religions. We try to still the will. Call it our pride, our ambition, our sense of self and entitlement, our refusal to pay homage. These things are all counteracted by the twin religions of Buddhism and Christianity. Schopenhauer goes as far as to say that he believes that Christianity actually comes from Buddhism because of a strong, studied perusal of the detailed and extremely lengthy Buddhist scriptures. He thinks he can deduce it from Buddhist scriptures alone. Well, Christianity comes from Judaism. We all know this. But there's something funny about it. It is a queer centaur to put Christianity, the New Testament and the Old Testament together. It's a strange arrangement. And Schopenhauer is rightly suspicious of it. He thinks that the metaphysical will, it's our job to counteract it at all turns. And we can do so by virtue of several human actions. One, for instance, is the ascetic lifestyle. The second thing you might do is the giving of alms. Thirdly, philosophy. It's very good at doing this. It stills you down and represents the world. The fourth thing that you might do is monastic life, And the fifth thing, and the most effective way of stilling the will, the metaphysical will, is through aesthetic appreciation. This is why we tend to go in search or in following of the dead by means of aesthetic endeavour. So we go to a funeral, for instance, and the tears start when the poems start getting read, or there is some sudden music. This is when we start to crack up. And in this way, we are going into the zone, or in the direction at least of the zone where the subject of the funeral has already gone. This is a zone where the will to live is now redundant. The individual specimen species has given up with that great turbulence, and now we, by virtue of art, are getting a promise of that time when the will no longer obtain, the wheel of Ixion will no longer turn, we will not be indentured under the whip of this Egyptian taskmaster. I've just broken the microphone. You see, this is the metaphysical will itself interfering with the sound system. You understand? Oh, it's happened before. Lights pop. Anyway, so basically a good example of this is that during the 1970s, New York was in a terrible state, as you know, and the subway system was absolutely disastrous. Am I way over my time? And a particularly enlightened person said, we've got to tidy this joint up and make it safe. So what he did was, through the tannoy system, he just played Mozart all day. You see? Now, the thugs and the ruffians ran for their lives because Mozart is kryptonite to their Superman. They go all weak. And this is really the metaphysical basis of what I call the metaphysics of Philistinism, that the Philistine is somebody who cannot tolerate for a moment his will, his pride, his lion mane being clipped, his roaring. So that's why when you have a riot, don't water cannon them. That's what they want. What you want to do is play them some small piano pieces by Grieg. You know, that'll do it. It will clear the joint. Unfortunately, the police would always also run as well. So it's a bit contrary. Schopenhauer's view is that art can still the will. And it's true enough. How do we get children to sleep? We call it a lullaby. We don't assemble flat-pack furniture to get them to go to sleep. Okay, well, look, I'm going too slowly here. Scripture and mythology. This is Hebrew mythology. I don't regard mythology as a falsehood. I think mythology are stories about what's absolutely true, absolutely fundamental. I just want to go into a wee excursion here about why sculpture is so controversial and why, after a long career in it, I've got wounds all over my body, everywhere but my back. And if we look at Hebrew mythology in particular, this is the book of Exodus. We will see a strange and very informative story. This is a painting by Poussin, and it's called The Worship of the Golden Calf. Now, nowhere in Scripture is the calf described as golden. That's something else. But it is in Scripture called the molten calf. And this is something very significant because it has originated from a model made, more than likely, of clay. Just hold that in your minds. Now, so the children of Israel have been led out of Egypt by Moses. They've been wandering and wandering and wandering. Moses is a kind of principle of the end, the perpetuum mobile of nature, of existence. He's the Trotskyite principle, perpetual revolution. You must keep on going. This is why pop music, for instance, often fades out. It can't face the terminal moment of the tonic chord at the end. Dead. So Mott the Hoople want to give you the impression that they're carrying on forever. No death, and that's why it's particularly, young people like it. They're terrified of dying. So Moses really represents this kind of thing, the perpetual thrust. And the children of Israel are, that's humanity, that's being. So they get to the foot of Mount Sinai. And Moses says, by the way, I'm off up the hill to speak to God. So the children of Israel are all, thank Christ. Well, they obviously don't say that. They say, thank goodness that motivated agitator this activist type, really, has gone away up there. So what is it the first thing they do? They obviously start making a clay model. And then they dig a hole, put a wee foundation in, build a pedestal. They have started to dwell, to stop, to become profoundly civilized again. It's the first step in the civilized, the idea of stopping, of dwelling. So Moses comes down the mountain. You can see him there. He's got the tablets. And what's happened is that they have done exactly what the first commandment, strictly speaking, is just an intro, you know. But when we get down to the actual detail of what you are and are not allowed to do, you get the second commandment, which is the first, in effect. You shall not make any images. And what have they just been doing? Making an image. That's pretty neat, that, isn't it? That tells us that this is terribly important, that God has said, you can't be sculptors, especially not sculptors of clay. You'll understand this. So what he does is, Moses gets his Levites, who are his enforcers, and rounds up the 3,000 men, women, and children who, under Aaron, have been involved in this public art project. Rounds them up and has them executed, right? Thus, directly countermanding the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. This proves that sculpture is worse than murder. And that's why we're all such a bunch of desperados, because if, according to some lights, Jehovah is really Mother Nature, and Mother Nature hates to be represented, because you do so in a parody form. You know, and make a statue of somebody, but it's a kind of parody of them. It doesn't have anything to do with their sound, their smell, their gait. It's got none of these things. It's a dead parody. So nature has, if Jehovah is Mother Nature really, then Mother Nature is taking dread fury against the idea of the representation. And I think this is an important story that tells us also that at a certain point, nature or the world made it clear that sculptors are beyond the pale. And that's why in the modern age, nowadays, you go to the art schools and you see that, yes, you can, I'm talking about the official art schools, yes, in the painting department, you can paint a picture. In printmaking, you get to do a print, screen print or something. In ceramics, yes, a pot. But in sculpture, you're meant to take photographs of yourself naked in compromising situations. Sculpture is the one department that has been absolutely closed down. And that's happened all through history. At the birth of Christianity, with the Coptic Christians and all the disruptions up through Syria, which were mimicked recently at Palmyra with the desecration of the antique remains there and the beheading of the curator. So we've done it all through history. Sorry. And this molten issue, this is an image from cinema of the Golem. It's quite an interesting thing. The Golem is the bogeyman of the Jewish people. Well, the more the Yiddish tradition, the more North Europe. The Golem is a creature that lives in the attic, and you threaten the children with it if they're being wrong. And the Golem is made up of sticks, straw, and clay. It's a clay model. Molten calf, obviously generated from a clay model. In the 20th century, there was a great movement against the use of clay in sculpture. And still to this day, I have students from art schools who have asked their tutors to get in some clay, and the tutors have said things to them like, no, clay is dead art. Clay is dead art. My tax dollars pay the salaries of these people. Here are two clay models. I'm just going to show you some work that I've done. These are two clay models on the go. They're made of soft mud. It's not plasticine or anything, so they have to be, or plastiline, I think you call it. They have to be wrapped each night, and they take a long time to make. That's my chief assistant, Lindsay, there. These are figures of St. Cecilia and St. Sabina for the front of the Golem Chapel by the architect Craig Hamilton, with whom I've had a long and very rewarding collaboration. We're working on something just now, which you'll see in a minute. So this is a private chapel down in the south of England. The designed for the Schwarzenbach family, and I've got lots of other works in there as well. So here's the interior of it. It's a vaulted arrangement. It's very stripped. It's very austere in its form, but Craig goes for extremely tight and constrictive architecture so that the client is in no danger of hanging a picture. And, it won't fit. So there's no room at all. It's absolutely packed in. And at the end of it, we've got this seated figure of Jesus here. People call it the seated Christ, as though that's significant. It's really weird. It's not. There's hundreds of images of Jesus sitting down. But for some reason, the seated, and he's on a klismos there, and he's presiding. He reclined upon his couch at the table in the upper room. This was very fiercely contested by a certain cleric that was in the scene. He said the work reeked of Presbyterianism, Protestantism. Meanwhile, my family, my departed, deceased, they're rolling in their graves, because I come from a pretty tough Baptist tradition, from the north of Scotland. We're very, very, very closed, You could read the Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress on a Sunday, but you couldn't have your bike out. There were no cards, playing cards in the house. That wasn't allowed. That's why my number bonds are so poor. Because kids who play cards learn number bonds very quickly. It's a great idea. But that was the devil's cards. It was as strong as that. Anyway, here I am, a proddy dog, making Pope work. So you can see how his feet cross at the front in anticipation of the great moment, and his hands hang forward, and the great beam of his seat at the back. So that was carved in Italy by some people at a company called Cervietti, the best carvers in the world. Now, I was just looking at that, so I'll just go back a wee minute. See there, you see how it's in this apse here, and the apse is circular. It has the circle, the sphere promised. There are sections of that. And I think this is one of the sources of the problem that we have here. The classical arts seek oikoiosis, the Greek word meaning everything matching together. So the Greek head, for instance, that Greek nose profile thing with very little recess in there. It's done by bringing the forehead forward and dropping the nose down towards a vertical, which means that the nose, which in humanity looks like a bit of cheese stuck onto the front of an orb, suddenly the nose is integrated and it becomes part of the forehead. And this is a way of bringing the nose into being. It's always a sense of achieving the one. And the surface, the circle, of course, is singular, and the sphere is three-dimensionally singular as well. This is something that is perennially annoying to modernist sensibility. So, where was I? I was trying to... Yes. So, for instance, this is a very famous image from El Lissitzky. It's Russian revolutionary work. It's entitled "The Red Wedge Invades the White Circle." The whites are the counter-revolutionaries in Russian history at that time, and the reds, of course, are the Bolsheviks. And what we see here is the bubble being burst. There's one main wedge, and then certain other little wedges going in and chasing off other little circles. The circle is the thing that we've got to try to oppose and overcome, because the circle connotes goodness. This is what makes Clara, my daughter, I think, instinctually see the goodness in the Great Dome, because it's at least half a circle at the beginning of the talk. So we see a similar rhetoric going on in town planning and monstrosity building in London today. So here, you see, here is the blue wedge actually threatens to invade, the sphere. It's the same old idea. And if I'm at my most Schopenhauerian and skeptical, I would say that this is, in fact, this kind of action really is somehow possibly connected with the spermatozoa penetrating the ovum in the process of the will to live. And this is one of the reasons where Christianity has such a difficult time amongst young people. It is, in fact, and I'm going to say something really controversial here, like Buddhism, a fundamentally life-denying religion. Now, that sounds terrible. I myself am a Christian. How could I therefore come to say such a thing as that? I've also said that neoclassical architecture is fundamentally life-denying. Everything that is shoddy, fierce, invasive, coarse, inarticulate, approximate, all these things, says Schopenhauer, are at root an affirmation of the will to live. Everything, on the other hand, that is courteous, self-effacing, dignified and chivalrous, everything that's careful and considerate and kind, is at root a denial of the will to live. This is very hard for us to accommodate because we are fabulously indentured to the process of living. You know, we've got it right, you know, we go way back with that instinct. But that's why you will get Philistines, because they are highly life affirmative. So you go to all the vitalist movements of the world. The Reformation, for instance. There's John Knox, the Scottish reformer, who personally takes charge of the destruction of St Andrew's Cathedral, the ruins of which stand today. There was never a more vitalistic creature than John Knox. The smashing of the statue is something in which he takes positive delight, glee. Something standing there dead and unmoving now goes crashing to the ground. The Buddhas of Bamiyan, remember them? They're blasted to hell by the Taliban. Not, I think, because they're pre-Islamic. I think it's because they stand there refusing to do anything, while these vitalists are tearing about stacked on top of jeeps. You know how they all seem to all want to hitch a lift on the one jeep? And you get the same with the activists today who are taking down statues. It's not the fact that they have a clue about the historical realities. They take down a statue because there's a statue to take down. They love it. So we must be, I'm just throwing this in to you. I mean, obviously, Schopenhauer was a coruscating atheist, but he had not given up on metaphysics. So I think maybe if he saw that and he thought, yeah, there's something's going to penetrate something else there. He might have said, he may have made that idea come forth. It's called the Shard, that building. A shard is a thing that you go to A&E for, to get out your eye. It's funny that you should talk about something as bad. It really is quite bad. Now, circles, okay, well, this is a work that I did for the Lady Chapel in that chapel in Golem, and you can see that the saints have all circular halos. There's Jesus and John the Baptist, and that's the Virgin Mary there in her aedicule. This is that relief was actually finally coloured. Secular work, Adam Smith. You see, when you see St Giles Cathedral behind him, you have the view with the drapery primarily there, because the drapery is tending towards the non-temporal. But then when you have the view with the city chambers behind him, you have his buttons on full display and whatever's in his pocket. You see what I mean? So people ask me, what's in his pocket? Actually, I don't know. It's none of my business. And then they say, well, you modelled it. Do you think I actually modelled a pipe and then stuck clay over it? Because people are quite, they go to pieces when sculptures in play. Sorry, can't get around with this. The statue of the architect William Henry Playfair, that was done about 7 years ago, I think. And it's a youthful statue. Playfair is the architect that makes all the Greek revival temples in Edinburgh. It's just a work that I laboured for 36 years to get to do and then finally did. James Clerk Maxwell, he's the one that unifies everything. Electromagnetism is really his thing. The space between the atoms you see in the objects is so vast, it's absolutely interstellar, that why doesn't the space that's between the atoms of my hand and the space that's in the atoms of this perspex not allow my hand to go right through the perspex. It's the electromagnetic force that does that, and that's what keeps us touching. Good. Right, this is the second last shot. This is a project that we've got on the go just now for Italy. It's to do a Calvary, and this is quite an undertaking. Typically, the work is being opposed. Often the case when a statue is being made or proposed, objections come flying in from sometimes the strangest quarters. Willful obstacles introduced. I've seen it all through my career, and when I was young, it worried me. Now I know and expect it. So we're going through one of these just now, and it's all to do with Italian VAT, value added tax. This has just thrown itself in as a little present from Satan himself. You think I'm kidding? No. So our patroness, who is a great lady and very devout, Anglican actually, she's bought that mountain there, that hill, on the top of which there's a small ruined monastery. That's now being fixed and stabilized. There'll be a refectory there, there'll be a chapel, there'll be a hermit that's employed to look after it. We actually went to interview a hermit about this. Her name is Sister Julia Holloway, an outstanding person, and she lives in Florence in the middle of a traffic roundabout. Which traffic roundabout is one of the most beautiful traffic roundabouts you've ever seen, because this is the Protestant cemetery in Florence, where all the people on the Grand Tour who located from Britain and North Europe, Protestant countries, when they died in Florence, they're buried there. So the Brownings are both there, for instance, the poets. So Sister Julia told us all about how she is a hermit, and she belongs to no order because of that, but wears a nun's habit. She looks after the cemetery and raises money for good works. Anyway, at the top of the mountain there, it's a hill. This is a garden laid out by Gian Lorenzo Bernini's brother, a hydraulics garden. At the top up there, we'll have this cross established with the figure of Christ, the corpus, on the far side of the cross, so that when you're up there looking at the figure of Jesus, you see the vast view behind. It's a view that will encompass Venice itself on a clear day. The statue will be enormous. So you see the far slide, there's a man indicated in there by means of a cutout. You see it? That's me. I'm roughly life-size. And this makes this one of the most colossal crucifixes ever made. We wonder if it maybe will be the biggest in the world. We don't care about that because we're into quality, not quantity. So with any luck, we'll get news quite soon that we've sorted out the Italian VAT. And then we can go ahead and start making the huge small model for this. It will be cast in Scotland near Inverness. Well, let's go to the last slide because it's been terribly rambly. It all started here, really, in ancient Greece. This is about 490 BC, we think. It's a piece of sculpture called the Critian Boy, because we know through some ancient sources that it was made by a man called Critios. It was found in the 19th century in a kind of dump. There it is. A corner of the Acropolis where broken things were lying. Well, the whole Acropolis was broken. It's a mysterious object. And what happens in this is that Critios, for the first time, he looks at nature and he sees that when we stand in a certain way. Hitherto, in the Kuroi figures, the crude ones, they would stand like this. And then they put a smile on the face. And of course, we're all desperate for movement, aren't we? So, because we love the movies, but we don't like the stillies so much. So, coming up, for instance, if Matt Damon says to me, Sandy, you want to come over to Hollywood and co-star with me in my next film? Folk are going to say, Sandy's really made it. But then conversely, if Matt says, can I come across to Paisley and work with you? Folk would say, what's wrong with Matt? You see? Because he's gone to the stillies. You see? Still means dead, fail. Movies mean go. So, The Greeks are trying to get this figure going. Smile. And so then they go, still looking terrible. So then suddenly, they go like this. And it's absolutely hopeless. So then Critias comes along and he says, look, let's look at nature. And you can see that folk are standing about. And then Peter will do this. You see? Horses do it. You know. So we all stand about like this. And we introduce an asymmetry into the affair. Asymmetry, and it's very interesting. James talked about symmetry with the corpus, with the whole thing in the church. We aim for symmetry. But here's somebody that actually makes an asymmetry. Contrapposto, it's called. So the shoulders remain level, but the hips drop. And this puts a bit of movement through the figure without it appearing to go anywhere or do anything. You see, it's movement without action. And it's a drop as well. A drop towards, again, the centre of that earth. In other words, that fundamental force of gravity is again being represented. Now, this is all voodoo stuff, and it frightens the living daylights out of the kids. People say to me in my studio, are you not frightened working in here amongst all these statues at night? No, I kind of know them inside out. But what's happened in this case is that scholars have studied, and they know that this figure, which is so revolutionary, that first did that explosion that went right through all the sculpture of the West. Something awkward happened because that piece of work was vandalized immediately after it was completed. And the head has been restored by the same hand as made the original, the whole figure. They know this. So I think what's happened is a primal moment of iconoclasm has occurred when nature has been seen to have been prosecuted, examined, and replicated. It's a terrible affront. You see, I know how to imitate people. I used to do a very good Prince of Wales. I don't do that anymore, you understand. But I would never do it in front of the person. That would be an absolute outrage. And in whatever happened to Baby Jane, you remember the film? The most frightening bit about it is when the horrible sister repeats back something that the one in the wheelchair has said. She says, oh, don't be so horrible, Jane, to me. And then she says, oh, don't be so horrible again to me. You see, this idea of having your own words thrust back at you in a funny, twisted tone. This is what sculpture does to nature. And I think this is its fundamental sin. So the work was smashed to pieces and then restored and then smashed again. Now we have it, it's the start of us all. Sorry. Thanks so much for your patience with me. That's me finished. Thank you.